The Holy Gospel according to John. Glory to you, O Lord. Jesus went to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, also called the Sea of Tiberias, and a large crowd kept following him, because they saw the signs that he was doing for the sick. So Jesus went up the mountain and sat down there with his disciples. And it was shortly before the Jewish feast of Passover. When he looked up and saw a large crowd coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, "Where are we to buy bread for these people to eat?" And Jesus said this to test him, for he himself knew what he was going to do. And Philip answered him, 6 months' wages would not be enough bread for each of them to get a little. And one of Jesus' disciples, Andrew, that's Simon Peter's brother, said to him, "But there is a boy here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are they among so many people?" And Jesus said, "Make the people sit down." Now there was a great deal of grass in the place, and so they sat down, about 5,000 in all. And then Jesus took the loaves, and when he had given thanks, he distributed them to those who were seated. So also the fish, as much as they wanted. And when they were satisfied, he told the disciples, "Gather up the fragments left over so that nothing may be lost." So they gathered them up, and from the fragments of the 5 barley loaves left by those who had eaten, they filled 12 baskets. When the people saw the sign that he had done, they began to say, "This is indeed the prophet who has come into the world." And when Jesus realized that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. So when evening came, his disciples went down to the sea. They got into the boat and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them, and the sea became rough because of the strong wind that was blowing. And when they had rowed out about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were terrified. But he said to him, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Then they wanted to take him in the boat, and immediately the boat reached the land toward which they were going. This is the gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Please be seated. Well, today's gospel reading introduces us to John chapter 6. And we're going to stay in John's gospel for the rest of the summer, except for the Feast of Mary, Mother of our Lord, in just a few weeks. And after that, we'll finally get back to Mark's gospel, which is that focal gospel for the liturgical year. But going from Mark now to John, we kind of need to reset ourselves in how we understand what we are hearing. You see, John is what I would call a special gospel. It's not one of the synoptic gospels, which are namely Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And so John's going to take stories and scenarios and kind of give them a different emphasis. He's going to use different language to communicate things differently to us than the other 3 might. And while there are so many unique differences between John and Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and even between those synoptic gospels, there's one miracle, only one miracle, that all of the 4 gospels agree upon and write about. And we heard that miracle today. Any guess what it was? We've got two options, feeding the 5,000 and walking on water. Which one do you think? And then there's mumbling about the people. It is feeding the 5,000, the only one that is in all four Gospels as a miracle. Now, I get why all four Gospel writers chose this particular one to include and emphasize. I mean, it's a memorable one, right? I mean, bread is something that everyone can connect with, no matter what type it is, if it's pita or if it's tortillas or if it's a good sourdough bread. And frankly, carbohydrates are absolutely delicious, right? So I would choose this one over and over again if it was me. So too, hunger is something that we all experience. And shared food is important to our species. And it's also a story that speaks of power and possibility. You see, there is power in bread. We see it played out every day in our lives. We see it on the political realm when the removal of WIC or link benefits are weaponized to control others. Far too often, we also see churches and other nonprofit organizations that are quick to give just enough bread to build dependency or to perhaps coerce people into attending religious services while completely ignoring systemic change needed for a just distribution of resources and policies that promote life. We see governments, regimes, groups, terrorist groups supply food or withhold food to manipulate others into specific actions or treaties or stances. Indeed, the statement, "Wars are lost and won with bread," reminds us of the power of bread and its impacts on nations. And you see, in Jesus' time, it was no different. For kings would often enforce their power by distributing or withholding bread. But the thing about today's reading is that it's not actually about the complete absence of bread. In fact, there was bread, but there was also a problem. You see, there were 5,000 people, and only how many loaves of barley bread? 6, 5, 4, 3, 2. It was 5. 5 loaves and how many fishes? 2 fishes. There we go. Everyone knocked that one out of the park. 5 barley loaves, 2 fishes. And so then the disciple Andrew says, what good are 5 loaves and 2 fishes in this crowd of 5,000 people? It's a question that insinuates the desire to throw in the towel. I mean, some might say it's kind of a logical question. Others might argue it's just completely common sense. 5 loaves, 2 fish, 5,000 people. Not going to happen. And that's the thing about Jesus' act. It was completely nonsensical. It was illogical. Indeed, it was absolutely absurd. And what makes it even more ridiculous of a story is that after 5,000 people ate from 5 little loaves and 2 fish, there was more bread than they started with. I mean, that makes no logical sense. And it's in John's telling of the story that we actually catch something different than we get in the Synoptic Gospels. Again, that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There we go. I was just feeling like people were going to be a little tired today, so we're just going to keep doing fill in the blank. So what we heard is that in John's telling of the story, that Jesus was the one who distributed the bread and the fish, while the Synoptics say that the disciples distributed the bread and the fish. You see, in John's gospel, it is very clear that Jesus is the one who provided access to the life that was given. It was Jesus who shared and made a statement. It was the action that communicates that our God provides, and not just provides a measly little crumb, but instead our God provides abundantly. It is a reminder that in the moments that we think there could be never enough, And at the times when it seems completely lost and impossible, how could these 5 loaves and 2 fish feed these 5,000 people? Well, it is in that moment where our God will do something unthinkable, something that is so illogical that it only could be attributed to God. And the thing about this story is that, yes, it is about satisfying the gathered people's hunger, but it's just as much about bread as it is about God's expansive provision. I mean, how often do we as a people hunger for something that is beyond just the food in our bellies? We hunger for justice in a world that abuses and takes advantage of women and queer people and BIPOC individuals and those on the margins. We see and feel our bellies rumble as we seek meaningful friendships and community and romantic partnerships in the absence. Hunger pains are felt when we seek that sense of purpose or meaning in our lives, our work, and our hobbies. We humans hunger for adventure and security, growth and fulfillment, and so much more than only bread. And I think that's part of the reason why those who came up with the lectionary readings, that's the readings that are appointed, I don't come up with them. I'm just like, I get handed them and it's like, dance, monkey, make something from this. And so I think that part of the reason why they took feeding the 5,000 and paired it together with the other miracle we have today is to remind us that it's more than about bread and fish. You see, in that story of Jesus walking on water, John's version again had something different than the synoptic gospels. Matthew, Mark, and Luke, right? You see, John's version didn't have someone step out onto the water. Any guesses who that person is in Synoptics? Peter, right? It's like, oh, waves going on, and then it's like, oh, there's a ghost, and then they're like, if you're really there, tell me to walk out on the water, and Peter walks out, and then he dies, and blah, 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 right? We're not talking about that today, though. There's no Peter stepping out of the boat. There's no Jesus rebuking the wind and the waves. And there's no just simple, we're trying to pass the time so that we can get to the other side of where we're going, and we needed to fill in the details of how Jesus wasn't in the boat and now he's in the boat. That's not what's going on here. Instead, the story of Jesus walking on water is so deeply important because of the way that it is deeply tied to Judaism and how it relates to the Hebrew Scriptures. So let's think back to a key character in the Jewish faith. Shout them out. There's like a bunch of them. So Moses, Abraham. Did I hear Abraham? Yeah. Noah. This is fun. How many more? Jacob. Good. Now, I knew that we had already passed the correct answer of where we're going towards in number 1. So it was Moses is where we're going, but you didn't know that based on my little question there. So now, but here's the thing. Last Sunday, if you were here, and even if you were not, last Sunday we read the beginning of Moses' story as he was pulled out of the basket in the water and became the adopted prince of Egypt, even though he was born to a Hebrew family. Now, what we know about Moses is that he eventually grows up and he begins to know of his Hebrew roots. And then with the help of God, he decides to liberate the people from whom he was born from slavery. And just before the ruler, who was called Pharaoh, anybody remember that from? Okay, anyway. So just before the ruler, Pharaoh, let the Hebrew people go, the people celebrated a meal that we now call Passover. That was the best one yet. Okay, good. So at this Passover meal, we've got this unleavened bread, right? That was eaten because there wasn't enough time, right, for the dough to rise, and they needed to leave and they needed to get out. So they quickly make this bread, it's unleavened, they need to get out of here. And then after they were released, they escaped through the Red Sea on dry ground, almost as if they were walking on water. You see what's going on here? This central story, these two miracles paired together, well, this is because they're connecting with what is a central, indeed pivotal story in Judaism, a story that is one of liberation, one that is about bread and water, and it is just like Jesus' miracles in today's reading. And why that is so important is that this story of Jesus, these miracles that Jesus enacted, of providing bread, of walking on water, these stories are as old as time in and of itself. In fact, think back to all the way in the beginning, where the Spirit of God hovered, indeed, perhaps walked over the waters. Or think about how, as those Hebrew people now go into the desert and they provide bread from heaven, this manna, enough for the people wandering in the wilderness. Or think about how our God promises to continue providing for us in all that we might need. You see, and it's not just providing enough, but rather God will provide an abundance. And so it is no coincidence that we as Christians, as people of faith, then that we gather around this table around bread and around that font with water. You see, these are reminders from our God from the very beginning that God is here among us and that God is with us for all of eternity. And part of the reason why this reminder of abundance in God's presence is so important, and why it comes up here at the beginning of a series of weeks where we're going to talk more and more about Jesus as the bread of life, as Jesus being the bread offered, is because these signs of God's abundance in the Scriptures, they are meant to help us then recognize God's presence in our lives. For these aren't just stories about something in a far-off land in a distant place, but these are stories here. For then we can come to realize God's abundance given. It's the abundance of love and generosity when friends and family gather together at baby showers or wedding showers or special gatherings. It's the sharing of a meal with another individual or holding the door open for someone. It's a capital campaign that has already raised over $950,000 from members and former members and community members who want to share God's presence more fully. It's our acknowledgement that we have a beautiful building, a large building that we don't use every single moment of the day. And so if we've been given that abundance, why not share it with others? Why not share that abundance with 12-step groups and summer camps and concerts? You see, it is God's ever-present reminder that there is enough food. There are enough homes, there are enough resources in this world to be shared abundantly with all whom we encounter. And so it is a reminder that instead of hoarding and holding on, we can be open to sharing. And you see, that is the gift of today's reading. In fact, that is the gift of our God from generation to generation. And so as we hold on to these readings today, as we look towards the table that we gather around in just a moment, I hope that we use them as reminders. Reminders that our God from the very beginning and far past our lifetime on this earth, that God will provide for all. I pray that we acknowledge that we have enough food to feed the hungry bellies, that we can acknowledge and nurture hungry souls, and that we can allow God's abundance to be felt through our actions, through our gifts of sharing, for the ways that we care for others. May we remember this day that God's abundance is in front of us, and then to look for opportunities to share our abundance with others in all that we do as thanksgiving for God's abundant gifts.